tu na chuan chang von soi tur ne piang te no pang ho ka lo chuak kula I fel de vin ron ding anga mo mu mal de ven chuan chang von soi kha kan lo ngai thodon ne Stephen hey a thok tu om tlat me sermon sei tu ran ya he Mizo hian kat som Chhunzawmna ne
Khungina le kalal pa chen dam tu iso Christiana chuan do thiang yang ngam chau hamane na chuan tu na le kum khai ro pui na on ra sen amen Pedro thun ni bung thum chang sum pariat
God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. He answers praise. He answers praise. He answers praise. He's so good to me. He loves me so. He loves me so. He loves me so, he's so good to me. Iswa so fin do do wa. Batian de machine. Iswa so fin do do wa. Alo lian do de la. Batian de machine. Tu sakina. Alo om do do wa. Luka bung nia sang song ngam nia
không inga le kanjal pa le chandam tu isko Christiana chuan lo thang le nan je u ane na chuan tu na le kum ko in wa puina om bo se amen peto wa thon ni bum thum chang sa pariat
Không ai na a le kandal pa le chandam tu iswa Krista shana a chuan lo thang lian au chu ane na chuan kum kho in ro puina omro se amen
không ai na a le fel không ai na a le kanlal pa le chandam tu iswa Krista shana a chuan lo chang lian ang che u ane na chuan tu na le kum khwa in ro puina om ro se amen thon ni petera bong thum chang so pariat
Không ngày na a le kan lo pa le chandam tu isa Krista sha na a chuan lo thang lian ak che u a an ne na chuan cùng qua in Robina om ro se amen Thoni patera bung thum cha sa paria Adi ne ba jan ale tawa se ne bung ka tang ka Nai ta o no te ne ja ja a o ko pi af cha ya ma nam sam na ver se chum ta ka
Stephen sit down long me
Happy Sabbath vakole Tuna hian iso Chhunzawmna tiang ka soi lu kan chan a chi kha le a chho le kha masaberin achang vungkha kasoyam pachanin khove lamange ema wangina fapan nei chuna ape a amaring tu apiang chu an bawra lo na toilet tuan nuna an nei jok thinan johana bung chum chang somparok isoka ama last night ania ama achitodona chu wangin ama kha lo na tuka ama disciples te pachu matlanga men ochai pui vero o gesto mani wana atia chu wangin ole atia le achone an thangbu na khan jai do wa khan an thanga isoka lo ochai donin ama disciples kha ena anomut lo veka ehe dar khan khatpo men veng pui thelo mo ti a chu wangin ochai a le chu wangin na vakala le ochai a la chone a en le a la chone anomut lo le a chu wangin a ochai le a le the last time lo ochai donin amaka alo la lo tuka ama chonte kha chisanin alo fara nai la khan le chong vanter ko te kha anokala le chakna alo pe a le isoka chau le a le achung chai le a changkhum zo akana disciples a an le a ama o imu chei to e min man tu te po anokal to e alo tia le chone anomana isoka miswal ang mei ang in anomana le an worship shipa gisokhana tilo tuka le chan ling lo kuman siama le amalu akhanan buntira isokhana tilo tuka chisenteka amalu tlang amalu chu amake tlang alofara le chong cross with do ang king tira cross chi angania cross ang kawa khang king tira iswaka ritalo tuka la cha thangku na khan ama ko le ke te kha pereknen anti ala cha iswaka na telo tuka au le cha ne ang ken beta le cha iswaka vanoma ena ama pa bulakha ama naidam ro mite an mani til tite an shalo ati a le cha ama bula mika ama left le right ta khan ama swal ba pani ve an ken be a ama adam one side mika pachani le lo mi ama kini ti dam la le nang ma po ti dam ro ti a ma se alelom le su he khatikan house pachana ni kha ama ka kan swala wangi kan chia lo ma chu ang ma swal de lovin chi ang ken bet ati ale cha ni isoka ena vano mai kai hu na ki mapo min sherang ro tia cha isoka ole vano ma ka mu be ang chi ati a le cha isoka achita a kaka soizo hu na khan le cha after 3 days a khan a chau le a le cha vano ma khana kai ma ina ma disciples bu la te khan ama wordi su ka local le choi don ati a ka omna a khan ka shai vyang che omna tam tak room tam do tian oma ati a la chane van ro ma khana kai ta chu wangin ke ni kha kan felangai van ro ma ka kam kai thai turin khovel zong ai na ro pui a ama omna chu wangin kan felangai bible te kan char tamangai kan ochai tamangai van ro ma kai turin Alpa ka sermon soite ma sono se.
Stephen athiam la mai chol ni ma sa khan thu soi ngai nom bon deu kan ngai thata bokha pastor moi te lo ngai thak du chan kan online khan ngai thak tu aw mani an vocabulary hi aturu khop me ma fa te puran man mai lap khanan mang lamane trong cầm hay gần church mấy cái mò rồi quý ta cái này. And now we're going to have our last session for our prophetic study. Mark, we are so happy to have you here, and we have been blessed and enlightened. And even the sermon you preached last night has already been watched by over 300 people. So you are actually preaching to the Mizo people around the world. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for sacrificing your time to come down here and visit us.
Oh, sure. It's my pleasure. Let's see if we can get set up here. Okay. See if this works. No, I better.
We haven't connected.
It will be better now. Yeah. 1 minute. It should be good.
Try it again.
All right. Let's begin with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you again for the word you have given to us. And we ask for your special blessing now as we continue our study into the predictions of Daniel. Amen.
Amen.
I want to talk a little bit about Islam because so many people ask.
Heta hian Islam chungchang ka soidona chan chu hei min zo tu tam em wangani.
And I can't talk everything, I can't explain everything, but I'm just going to talk about a little part of Islam today.
Azba hian ka soibek theidon lowa amara chu Islam chungchang tlem te ka soidone.
Islam has a profound impact upon the Christian church.
Islam chungchang a hian Christian te din huna nasatak main ngong anei wangani.
If I had time, I'd go into Revelation 9, because Revelation 9 gives a very clear picture of how Islam impacted the Christian church.
Thupuan bungkwa kalanga chuta chuan Islam sa ko hian Christian te ngong na chat je chungchang an zia gani.
But this afternoon, I want to just focus on what I consider to be the reference of Islam in Daniel 11.
Amar chu ban chuna hian Daniel abung so pakhat chungchang Islam chungchang ka hudan ka ron soidone.
Just a quick review. The king of the north, king of the south is all through Daniel 11. King of the north is the countries north of Jerusalem. King of the south, countries south of Jerusalem. And then we have the last climax of Daniel 11, which is this conflict, this intense conflict at the very end of time between the king of the south and the king of the north.
Heta hian chimlam lal le malam lal chungchang kan ngai thla ta chuan a vor to kan thlenga ti hianin chimlam le malam lal chungchang kan soidone ngai to hodone.
So just a quick review. Verses 31 through 30 describe papal Rome, their history from AD 538 to 1798.
Heta hian chang somthu pakhat ta somthu pakwa hian Papal Rome chungchang AD zanga somthu pariat tanga sangka dasri somko pariat thing aron soya.
These verses describe its rise to power.
Heta hian an lo chak chhoda la soya.
Its attack on Christ in the sanctuary.
Isu ai tinga biak bu ka peidan.
And even worse, well, not worse, but as bad, the persecution of the saints.
Mithiang him te tinu da chungchang po tel bokani.
So, as I said this morning, with a high degree of certainty, we can know that the king of the north in verse 40 is papal Rome.
Tukin sikan si tong khan marlam lal hian ange anti de chuan papal Rome ko bani.
But then we said, well, who is the king of the south? And I described that. We went into much detail.
Chumine chuan chimlam lal chu ange anti ti kan doni.
But I want to just focus upon the birth of Islam.
Engtinge Islam sa ko hilopian kan nga.
And starting with the birth of Ishmael.
Ishmael apian antang kan podang.
Now, in Genesis chapter 15,
Genesis bung so panga chuan
Abraham is frustrated.
Abraham chu bei donga.
He says to God, look, you have given me no offspring.
Lalpa engma thareng reng chithareng min pelawatia.
You know, God appears to him in a vision.
Pathian su ilana arun langa.
And says, don't be afraid. But then he says, Lord, you have not given me any children. I am childless.
Lalpa fa ren ning pelo tu nen fa nei mi ren ko ma.
And in Genesis 16, Sarah is frustrated.
Genesis bu som par ba chuan sari po be don thu kan mua.
They had been waiting and waiting and waiting for the promise of this child that God had promised.
Fa nei tu da pathian in thu tiam chu an nga ren ani.
So she says to Abraham, go into my maid, and perhaps I can obtain children by her.
Sari chu na pasal ne na kan chia lo nu ne na hian pakala ama atangin fa ta po kan nei ma na ti ne.
And that's what Abraham did.
Chu Abraham na tia na pui thuang chuan.
And it worked.
Chu tiang chuan ang pen ang chuan arun len suak ta ne.
A male was born, a male child.
Fa pa arun pianga.
Now, I think it's interesting to look at the promises that God made about Ishmael.
Pathian ta hian Ishmael chu changa thu tiam apek kan endo ne.
I mean, you know the story about how Hagar became arrogant and then Sarah drove her out.
Hagar chu arun chapawa arun laliana chu wang chuan iting asarin atno chu pokan thria.
And God appears to Hagar.
Pathian chu Hagar ne arun lan.
And notice what he says.
Chu ta chu na nge soi.
I will multiply your descendants exceedingly.
It had the after chu achi de kuang de chu enga bazan de bung do ne atiane.
So that they shall not be counted for the multitude.
An tam jia chu chia sen rual an nilawang.
So God is appearing in compassion and love to Hagar.
Pathian chu Hagar chunga khongai na le lein na in akhat ani.
He's given her the promise that every family wanted to have a lots of descendants.
Chung ko tirna an duang chi mal sawna tam tak chikla tam tak pung turin pathian mal sawmani.
Now Abraham was deeply had a deep love for Ishmael.
Abraham upon afapa Ishmael chu amai le ni ti riata.
And he talks to God as saying that Ishmael will be my heir.
Pathian na tong ta Ishmael chu ka ro khom tu nur turin atia tong ta ya.
But God says, no, he will not be your heir.
Masa pathian in iro lo tu ani lo wang atia.
But he also demonstrates a promise, gives a promise about Ishmael.
Ama ro chu pathian in Ishmael chung changa thu tiam apeve thuni.
He says, as for Ishmael, I have heard you.
Ishmael nanghi kriya chani.
Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly.
Ishmael chu mal som na satak mai ka bu do ni ti na soini.
Now when God makes a promise like that, when he says exceedingly, he means exceedingly.
Pathian na satak ati ne chu na satak tin aron thleng top mai ne.
So God makes these promises to Hagar, he makes them to Abraham. He demonstrates his great concern for Ishmael.
Pathian chu thu tiam chu Abraham ne na te Hagar ne na te aron tiam feka aron thleng ani.
Now think for an imagination, what it would be like to be Ishmael?
Ishmael chung changa hian mani halin chan chin ta leng in mitla ta chin
From the moment he is born, he is told he will inherit everything that Abraham has.
Apian chan tir changin Abraham na an eng zong chu aro chung pek do ne ti kha.
And Abraham was a large tribe.
Abraham chu chiro pui tak mai ania.
And tribes in those days were like nations.
Ta chu achi chu ro pui em mai Israel chi.
There were no apartments, no grocery stores. You could not survive alone. You had to be part of a tribe. And he must have been told over and over again, you're going to be the head of the tribe. You're going to be the king of the tribe. So he was treated like he was a very privileged young boy. He grew up thinking of his great future that he was going to have. But then imagine what it was like when Isaac was born.
Amaro chu Isaka aron pin ve thu chu enge ron thengta.
Ishmael was 14 years old.
Chu ti la chu Ismail chu kum som palimi nia.
And suddenly everything changes.
Chu ti hula chu eng kim mai eng thak thengta hluk mai ne.
Ishmael is displaced.
Ismail chu apai seina ake chia.
Suddenly he is nothing. He is not going to be the king of the nation, the tribe.
Voi le khata apai sei chu achia chi zong zong chunga lal ber lu ber ani tu po chu apai sei po chu ke chia ne.
Not only is he displaced, but he is evicted and banished from the tribe.
Ama chu ina changin no chu ania mundanga no chu ania ne.
Now, in those days, that was the equivalent of a death sentence.
Chu ta chuan thi thu pek po adong bokani.
And he probably would have died except God intervened.
Pathian achunga anuna en ro lo ni chuan thi turani.
He provided water and sustenance for Ishmael.
Pathian Ismail ta na tuya pe ani into.
And then he says to him, I will make him into a great nation.
Ani chu Ismail chu chiro pui taka namro pui taka kadin do ne tini pathian.
Now it says in Genesis 21:29, he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer.
Genesis musom ni paka cha som ni pakwa chuan thalera arun liana te chuan thalka thiam taka alo chuakani.
And he must have been a talented leader because he became the head of 12 tribes.
Heta hian leader hoi to ro pui tak ani mela chan chu chi rang rang chi som pani chunga ho tu alu ber ani ni.
12 tribes. Does that sound familiar?
Zu mi chi som pani chu
Yeah, 12 tribes.
Inkhawm
Just like, right?
nam som pani.
Tribes of Jacob, right? And here are the names of the tribes.
Hela
They're right there.
nam som pani chun ziaka
12 tribes of Ishmael.
Ismail chi de kuang te nam som pani ni ni.
Now, Hagar chose heathen wives.
Hagar hian afapa Ismail ta na ring lo mi nupui anei saka.
And his wives led him into idolatry.
Ismail nupui te chuan milen biak na an khoi lu ta ni.
Now, here's a quote from Patriarchs and Prophets.
Helai mi hi pis hoi dizia kan chiar nge.
Abraham's early training, now remember, he'd been taught by Abraham, his early teaching had not been without effect upon Ishmael.
Abraham azetina afapa Ismail azetina chu ngong anei thu viau lo wa.
But the influence of his wives resulted in establishing idolatry in his family.
Achan chu anu puin milen biak na chung changa a khoi lu tlat wa ani.
Separated from his father
Apa he na tanga ai chan chu chu.
and surrounded by wives who did not love God, embittered by the strife and contention of a home, destitute of the love and fear of God, Ishmael was driven to choose the wild, marauding life of a desert chief.
Heta hian Hagari apa he changin Ismail chu ka de suan anu pui le chevel chetatna milen bia sa ko si ka te telabangin pathian na khelo phane.
But notice what it says here.
Heta hian ange soi en sinang.
In his latter days, he repented of his evil ways and returned to the God of his father Abraham.
Amara chu Ismail hi anun tom lampanga chuan pathian na ai lam le tin arun kir le a pathian na apa pathian chu arun von le ni.
Fascinating. He was his tribe became, his descendants became Arabs and embraced Islam.
Amara chu ama chi le kuang te ho chuan. Hemi Muslim sa khona hi arun din chuaka.
But he himself returned to the faith of Abraham.
Achi le kuang chu Islam sa khwa arun din chuan ni ma se ama ta ka chu apa pathian he na arun kir le ni apa pathian he na arun kir le ni.
Now I want to go back to Daniel chapter 11.
Daniel bung som bakala kan kal kir le nga.
Let's see. And again, at the time of the end, king of the south shall attack the king of the north, and the king of the north comes against the king of the south and is victorious.
Hetan kan huangin sinam lal le malam lalan.
Now we talked about that this morning. He's victorious. He overwhelms the king of the south.
Malam lal chu arun zaklea.
And this represents world conquest. And that's what Revelation 13:3 says. All the world marveled and followed the beast. The beast is the king of the north.
Heta hian malam lal ina ko chu sahami sakol hian ya chu chun khovel pui an ne ti kha ania ni.
And all who dwell on the earth shall worship him, except, of course, later on, except those who keep God's commandments.
Pathian thu oi ta chau lo chuan adang na zong chuan chu sakol chu an zui ve kani ti ni.
But let's go to verse 41. It says, the king of the north shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. So here is victory. It's a picture of victory.
Heta hian malal chuan sakna rom nei thu kan huwa sakna chungchang kan hu ni.
And I would suggest to you that this is a spiritual conquest.
Hei hemi chakla kan ti hi tharau lampang in dona chakna ne na ania ni.
But notice something in verse 41.
Ama chu chang somli pakara chuan hetin kan huthaya.
Not everybody is conquered by the king of the north.
Malam lal chuan mi zong zong an ne big vek chung lo ni.
Edom, Moab, children of Ammon escape from the king of the north.
Malam lal atanga an ne thelo malam lal le an ne thelo chu Edom te Moab te tin ba ka Ammon le atha te ho ka an ne te lo ni.
Now, who are the Edomites today?
Edom mi ho chu tu tenge tu nang tu lai khowela hian
Who are the Moabites?
tu ho tenge
And who are the children of Ammon?
Ammon ho tha te po tu tenge ni.
They don't exist.
Anom to lo he khowela hian.
So this must be symbolic.
Chu wang chuan hei na en ti re chu en ti na chau ani.
When we're talking end time prophecy, we see a lot of symbolism.
Khowel to ma chung chang kan en chuan en ti na tam takin arun lan chua tira.
Countries, tribes, individuals that were literal in the beginning in the Old Testament become symbolic at the end of time.
Ram ten nam te na atan tira om thi na khama se khowel to lampang ve thung la chuan en ti na ani to thung ni.
So the question is, what do they symbolize?
Chu mi ne chuan eng teng en ti ta nia.
Well, typically, you look at the characteristics of those entities in the Old Testament, and you look to the present to see if those characteristics exist in a group today.
Chu mi ne chuan hun kal ta thutlung lui hun lai kan an thil tiang chi le an mani ni nang chi kha tun khowel to phuna hian kha tiang kha an ni em ti kha kan te khina kan khai khina ngai ta ni chu.
Well, let's go back and look at Moab and Ammon.
Moab mi te le Ammon mi te chu enge tu tenge ni ti en chinang.
Genesis 19:36 says, both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father.
Genesis book som kwa cha som thum par kwa chuan apa lotafa lotan afanu te hena naw pa ti ti kan huwa.
This is when he escaped, and there was incest.
Ta chuan an ni kha I ram ka na tang kha tan chu ka.
Now the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab.
Fanu pakhat chuan in fa nei anei ma sak chuan afa mi nga chuan Moab ti na vo ming.
And the younger also bore a son and called his name Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites.
Afanu no pang zo pa chu na fa pa run thring ve Ammon ti na bing arun pe ve anak thla tu te ho ani ni.
Now, who is Edom?
Edom chu tu nge ni ta.
Well, we know from Genesis 25 and other verses who Edom is. It says Esau said to Jacob, feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was Edom.
Heta hian Genesis bung som ni panga cha som thuma chuan Edom ti chu Esau ani ti kan hu ya.
So Edom is Esau.
Edom ti chu Esau ti na ni.
So what are the characteristics of Edom Moab, and Ammon.
อันนี้ส่วนเอโดมติดเต็มโมบอามอนเฮาแต่ส่วนเองอังมีนุ่งจังกุมีเนี่ยอันนี้ที่อันชินัง
Well, I think there are two characteristics.
เฮตาเห็นนุ่งจังอันนี้หูเทีย
They are close relatives of Abraham and the Israelites.
ปะคันนาส่วนอับราฮัมและอิสราเอลเตนเองกุมไก่
But unfortunately, all through the history of Israel, they are also bitter enemies.
อามาเราจะบรรลุทักต่อไม่อันมานี้น้ำพริมให้อิสราเอลตานาเลยอันขาดที่เฮียนอิสราเอลตานบวยนั่นเห็นตู้อันนี้นี่อันเมลมาเนี่ยนี่
So I want to ask you the question.
ส่วนเราไปหมดตั้งไว้จู่
Is there a large group of people that are close relatives of Abraham and the Israelites, but they're also bitter enemies?
มีอับราฮัมเตสักเตนะอิสราเอลเตนะอินไนไฟตักซีสุดยังมีเขาปอลขัดสุมาเซมีแต่หัวในบ็อกซินโอแมงที่นี่ส่วนนั้นจู่
I don't know if you know Gerard Domstig, but he is a professor at the seminary at Andrews University.
Professor Andrews University มีอะไรมิงคารอนสวยขันเนี่ย
And about 40 years ago, he talked to me.
กุมสมิกัลตาคานที่เฮียนมิน
We had a conversation about this,
มินเบียให้มินจุนจางเฮียน
and he said this,
จุลายสวยจะตีเฮียนี่
Mark,
มา
close relatives of Abraham, bitter enemies, they represent Islam.
เฮตาเฮียนมีปอลขัดอับราฮัมมีแต่ในบ็อกซีสักอิสราเอลมีแต่ในกุมไก่ในบ็อกซีมาเซมีดังแต่หัวจู่อิสลามฮีนี่ที่มินเทียนนี่
Now that makes sense to me.
จู่ส่วนอมเสียในกระดาน
However, I realize others could have a different opinion.
อามาเราจู่มิเทนกับส่วนที่เตียนี่เราวินไงดันดังแต่ปอไงดันช่างแต่ปอในแบบไทยปกนี่
But let's assume for a minute that they do represent Islam today, Muslims.
อามาเราจู่สุดยังมีจู่แอนติตานะมุสลิมนี่อินเราปมโดนตัดชินิละ
Think about what that means.
สุมีนะอินก่อจู่เงี้ยนี่ตั้ง
It says they escape from the king of the north.
อันนี้เขาฮีมาลำเล่าเนี่ยนะจังอ่ะหุ่มหิมตาเตปูดสวกเตหลานสวกแต่อันนี้ตีนี่
You know, so many people ask me because, I have lived in a Muslim country. I taught in Indonesia, and I was surrounded by Muslims and Islam. And I had a chance to study it a little bit. And so people ask me, well, what is the role of Islam? And how does Rome ever get them to comply with the mark of the beast?
เฮตาเฮียนอิสลามสากลเนี่ยตั้มตะกินอินคอมไว้นะกันในเวกันอินคอมเวทีนะก็โซลเวทีนะสติรัวจวนโรมเลยให้มีมุสลิมที่เองที่เงี้ยเอ็นกุ้งไก่ดานที่บอกค่ะกับว่าซิรเวบุกะ
And my response is, maybe they don't.
สุนัยจวนบินอัศานก็ตอนนั้นจู่อิสลามเตเลยให้มีโรมที่อินกุ้งไก่ดานในโลกไม่ถี่ที่นี่
I am intrigued by the statement that in the latter days, Ishmael repented of his evil ways and returned to his father's God.
สุนัยก็เรียนรู้ก็เขียนจู่อิสลามรุ่นให้มีอิสมาเอลฮีอาจารย์ที่รัชส่วนประเทศเนี่ยจังบางบุมาเซอาหุ่นต่อว่าส่วนอาป้าประเทศเนี่ยนะอารุณเล่เลยอะไอ้อินชีนิติกับโมเน่
So I'd like to ask the question, is it possible that before Christ returns, Muslims will follow the example of their father, Ishmael, and return to the God and faith of Abraham?
จู่ไม่นี่ส่วนยิสุคริสต์โลกัลมาโลกัลโดนาเฮียนอันป้าเบลซูเอนโตนินอิสมาเอลเอนโตนินมุสลิมเทียนนี่กินะยิสุคริสต์โลกัลมาเฮียนอินลำเลียตินไอ้ชีวิตปอนไม่เท่นี่
If that is true, it tells me that Islam, Muslims, will escape the king of the north.
จู่ไม่นี่ส่วนมาลำเล่าเนี่ยนะจังอินหุ่มหิมนะอันมุดอนตีนะอันนี้จู่
They will not submit to the authority of Rome.
โรมสาขอทุเดนั่นอันนี้ตุลูโดนหลงตีนานี่
And they will not receive the mark of the beast.
มี sakol chin chen an dong lo tina ne
And they will join God's remnant church
chung mi te chuan
in welcoming Jesus when he returns.
at thala bang ko kan ni an som don ani
So the king of the south is conquered by the king of the north.
simlam lal chu malam lalin ania
Edom, Moab, and Ammon are not. It says very clearly, they are not conquered by the king of the north. They escape.
amara chu edom te mob te amon ho te chu malam lal an ne lo be thum ani
Therefore, the king of the south cannot be Islam either.
chu bang chuan simlam lal chu muslim ani thei do lo ti kha
Because the king of the south is conquered by the king of the north.
a chan chu simlam lal chu malam lal an ne ti tlat bang ani
And Islam, Muslims are not.
ma se muslim te chu an ni be si lo ni
Now, the reason I tend to believe this is because I lived in a Muslim country for a number of years.
tu na karin dan hi karin na chan chu muslim sa khwa bia te ho na hun rei tak mai kalom be to thin ba ani
And I taught at a university in Indonesia called Universitas Adventist Indonesia, which just means it's the University of Indonesia, the Adventist University. And we were surrounded by Muslims.
Indonesia University a ka thok ya ta chuan muslim ho ten min hwal vel thu ani
And I had a chance to observe them.
chu ta chun an tin hun ten om dan te ka en ti khai be thina
I was amazed at how friendly and hospitable they were.
mi biak le biang nuam tak le kom nuam tak te po an ni ve
Very reverent,
min sa thiama
very respectful,
mi an ti thaen em thina
and very reverent towards Allah.
mi te sa ko chung cha an sa ai me men pathian kha
While I was at that university, I had a chance to visit with the chair of the religion department.
chula university ka thola chu an sa ko ho tu an chairman nei na hun ka ne
And this is an Adventist university, and he was an Adventist pastor and teacher,
Adventist University ni Adventist city
but he had been a Muslim.
amar chu muslim lo
He had grown up as a Muslim.
muslim sa ko sailian ania
And he said this to me one time.
chu chung kan hena ti hena sia pai ka chu
He said, Mark,
mar
a pious Muslim lives a more godly life than the average Christian.
muslim sa ko dik tak mai chu christian sa ko mi ai an sa ko mi zo tai ni tin mi thil ni
That tells me that there's a lot of Muslims that would accept Jesus Christ if they just had an opportunity.
chu bang chuan muslim tam taki chatu na chang tur hi ne kana alai lam le
And God is going to call them out.
pathian an chu ho chu ala ko chuak nge yang
We had, when I was there, you know, it sounds kind of strange, but we actually had a maid. Because the local people want you to have a maid because it gives them employment, gives them money.
chulai ko lai chuanin om pinom pui kan nei ve a chan chu tiang hun lai chun a than te chan chu na kan siam chu kali nom pui ta na khan lo an nei ve phani
And this, they call them amas.
chu te ho chu ar ting ko wa
And I'll never forget, this Amma wanted to become a Seventh-day Adventist.
chulai ka nom pui chu 7-day Adventist ni arun tu ani
But she lived in a village where the house that she occupied was owned by the village.
amara chu khote a oma chu mi a in chu khote ina an nei in
And
ni lawa
they threatened her, because she was a widow, they threatened her that if she ever became a Christian, she would have to leave her house.
amara chu ni kha mai thai nia hemi christian lu phat chuan in hi chu asan nga in ti in an vo wangin
I believe God has great love for the Muslim people.
pathian en muslim te amma yang amna sa takin amma ti
He had great love for Ishmael and promised great promises, made great promises.
Ishmael sunga pathianin thutiam thatak mai aneng chi khan ani pohen ani.
And I think this verse tells us that a large number of Muslims will receive the seal of God and join God's remnant people and be ready for Jesus when he comes.
Pathian sin chena hemi muslim tam tak hin kin anla neinga hemi athala bang ko kan anla zom baringani.
This gives me great hope.
Chuan bai sena sang tak min pe
Because I believe that God has not forgotten the descendants of Ishmael.
Achan cha pathianian Islam Ishmael atha te ho ya thei ni lin karing lo ni.
He still has a great love for them.
Pathianian atha te ho zom no chu mangai takin le en kol ni karin da ni.
And I believe that even now, especially now, many are receiving the three angels' message.
Chu wa chu tu na po hian Islam sa ko bo en bitam tak hian
Through AWR and through media.
vantir ko pathum thu cha media tang te hian kaltlangin an dong bereng bokoni.
And I look forward to seeing my dear Indonesian Muslim friends in God's kingdom.
Sulai chuan Indonesia kan mi le sa te Iso Krista chatuan da ma ka hu ka bai se ni.
Thank you very much.
In zabai chuan ka lo me.
La nung kan lo sanga sol thlem na tui phone kara hian ti kha cha number som paruk na nem o som pasarina ani kha kan zain kan dinga tholom kan la tilo mo o tholom kha khongin Johnson tetlar khan lo khonlok mero se o pathum kha Johnsona pui puya tunga dang fel le duk tur os Steven kha o ta ham pakhat ka Johnson lo chhawra ta pu pe ta hian tholom kha kan tong trai to lo menga khala khan nu alo da ula chon ban na hla kan sanga a top kharna kha puma phonga tong trai na in kan khar don nya